All right, just a reminder to check out Dustbowl Diatribes, our podcast, on pretty much any platform. You can find it. It's on the Morin Academy website as well. And check that website out. I'll put a link below. Also, I just want to remind people you can sign up for our newsletter that's going to be coming out soon. And there will be a link below as well to sign up for that. All right, so back to D.C. Schindler's The Politics of the Real, the Church Between Liberalism and Integralism. And I'm going to take off on chapter 3, which is entitled The Merely Political Common Good on the Totalitarianism of Incompetence. And I have to say, I really like the title. We do definitely live in the totalitarianism of incompetence. This chapter a lot of it is about comparing negative freedom and positive freedom. And those are terms that extend beyond Dr. Schindler's analysis or beyond even particular schools of political thought. They're big categories and they require some unpacking, which I will do. But it's a useful tool to get Schindler's argument forward, to move it forward into answering the question, so what do you have in mind? Okay, because by the end of this chapter, he starts to give us some idea. So when it comes to negative freedom, for instance, Schindler says the desire to protect individual freedom inclines the liberal theorist to restrict the definition of the common good as far as possible, right? The state, therefore, is a fairly negative instrument of power. It's seen as serving the individual in protecting his rights and freedoms to do as he wants, but the state does not serve as an authority on his welfare or on the meaning of life. That's something that he has to find some sort of avenue towards understanding and living out on his own. So the state is there to protect his right to do that. And that means, if necessary, stopping other people or entities from interfering with his freedom to do so. Okay. So that's negative freedom. It's freedom from interference. And in our system, it's the negative freedom of the individual, right? To be free of hindrances, undue hindrances, with some exceptions from the state and its mission pretty narrowly construed to protect us from each other, right? So laws against crime and enforcement of crime and provision of some basic infrastructure, both physical as well as organizational, so that society and economics can operate. But it's still largely infrastructure that allows people to do what they want, how they define it. It is, in that sense, not an authority on what they should do. And that's the main point that Schindler wants to get across. So the right of religious freedom, that is often extolled as the highest achievement of our liberal democratic system, enshrined in the First Amendment there, is also a negative freedom. Okay. The state, of course, is limited by the First Amendment and cannot coerce faith or worship. It's supposed to be relatively neutral in that regard. It can be seen as allowing private entities to be free enough to foster religion in society as they see fit. It's possible to see the liberal state as a sort of benign endorser of religion in general as a social good by allowing that freedom of religious entities to do and speak as they want to. But basically, the way it does that is negative. It removes obstacles and the efforts of others to oppose one another's faith or even lack thereof, as atheism is also a choice, as well as, obviously Schindler is a Catholic Christian thinker, but in this type of system, pretty much all faiths are respected, as well as a lack of faith, right? And the state removes obstacles to you expressing whatever faith or lack thereof you have. Faith is seen as a private choice again by individuals, and therefore, and this is essential to his argument, it cannot be a part of the common good. Faith cannot be seen as a part of the common good in this system, something that is good for all, because this is a very simple point. It can't be, because it's seen as an individual choice or option that people can take or leave and can make very radically different choices. Okay, so one might say that we've chosen freedom as the common good, but we can't say we've chosen faith as a common good there. All right, so he goes further to say that, this negative freedom encompasses what people often highly value in a system such as the United States, which is that people can get involved in promoting their religious values and try to make them a part of the law, therefore enforce some of their religious values on others, okay? Such would have been the case with the puritanical prohibition movement back in the day, right? Or currently the pro-life movement, which had a major achievement in, the striking down of Roe versus Wade with the Supreme Court decision that was the culmination of a political process. Or other laws like laws or regulations restricting pornography, which people of faith may think is a threat to public morality. People have a right to pursue making these things law through the political process. They have the full freedom, therefore, and he makes a big point of this, they perceive that they have that full potentiality, right? There in the liberal system, there is the sense that if we can only, persuade the majority, we could get every piece of our faith potentially written into law, and therefore it could literally become the common good. But of course, in reality, that's never going to happen in a society where people differ so much. And even if it did, it would have been transformed into not a faith-based thing, but a law-based thing. Okay, something enforced by the government, but not necessarily embraced internally by the people involved. So a question crossed my mind, again, not so much now, but maybe a few decades ago, there was a major push on the part of evangelical Christians for prayer in the public schools, which strikes me as an attempt to do something a little bit stronger than, say, overturning Roe versus Wade or prohibition, because if it were done, it would involve an institution of the state literally teaching a religion, because the assumption was that it would be a Christian prayer. And so this struck me at first as like, well, here's an example that kind of crosses that line. And if that had happened, would that not have meant that the state and the church had kind of unified on that score in teaching a particular common good? Well, I think that ultimately Schindler would still put even that type of political activity, even if it had been achieved, into this liberal category. It would be an attempt to cultivate the common good, but it would still be expressed through private choices. And by that, I mean that in going to the school, right, you make a choice. In listening to the prayer, taking part in the prayer, you make a choice. There would have been endless debates about what kind of prayer it ought to be, with everybody wanting to make choices. Okay. And so it still would have been, in effect, most fundamentally, a political choice, right? That would only happen if enough people wanted it to happen. And then they'd have to get down to the business of what exactly should we be teaching our kids? And that could change from vote to vote, see? And so I think, I may be a little bit simplifying his point here, but I hope I'm capturing the essence of it. He says religion cannot be an actual realized common good in this system, okay? But the individual has a protected freedom privately to think that it is, and to give public expression to this private thought along with others who share it. Indeed, he has the right to do everything within certain limits to persuade others to share it. And he ends that line of thinking with the statement, which I thought was really, really nice and pithy. He says, but of course, a merely private common good is an oxymoron. I'm trying to capture exactly what he means here, but I mean, at the very least, we can say you can't have a common good that's real unless people actually buy into it, not just the majority. He doesn't make a lot out of majoritarianism, but I got to think it's in the background here, to say that, well, at any given moment, the majority can decide whether to be pro-life or pro-choice, and then we can dictate the results through the law. Is still to say that, the majority is made up of individuals and they have to vote, right? And they can try to transform their privately held concept of the common good into law, all right? But it's not going to be the common good of everybody because there's no felt community agreement about it. They're not living in the same worlds. I think that's become rather abundantly clear of late, that in a lot of ways, people are not living in the same psychological, spiritual, emotional, in all kinds of ways, space, okay? And living really in two different worlds. So, I mean, that poses a real problem for Schindler and people like him, on the question of how could you ever have a society with the level of agreement who all kind of lived in that same mental space, for whom the other options, the choices and the idea of personal individual freedom to choose whatever was no longer looming on the horizon of everybody all the time as it is right now. Well, he's going to try to answer that a little bit. But before he does, he has to get into the whole concept of positive freedom. And he's contrasting it with the negative freedom, right? And first of all, I mean, he says, and I want to emphasize, it is the religious idea of freedom. It's just that in countries like the United States or liberal democracies, it's been so watered down that people have largely forgotten this is kind of the essence of religion, like it or not. Okay. So as I was reading this, I was thinking, I've read some Muslim thought, not a lot, but I've read some Muslim thought regarding whether Islam can be compatible with liberal democracy and capitalism. And the more strict a writer is in his Islamic faith, the more he tends to argue that the two are not compatible, and to argue that the reason why is because Islam, for instance, poses freedom as positive freedom. A person isn't free until they are in the right position relative to God, until they submit to God's will and they understand God and they're integrated into the Islamic faith in this way, in every aspect of their lives. And if they live in a state where, the laws are aiming towards that ultimate good of submission to God's will, right? Then one could say that they are free. So the liberal notion of freedom to do whatever you want doesn't compute with that. All that's saying is that if you really believe in your God and in your faith, you tend to think that people won't be free until they believe it and until they truly accept it and live in it, not perfectly, but in a society that reflects it so that they can live it out. This is defined as what it means to have full human flourishing, is to live it out. So it's the same thing with a Catholic thinker. he is basically saying the same thing, that the Catholic Christian idea of freedom is to define the good life as living in a Catholic community, in a society that supports a person in their road to full communion with God in Christ and all of that, okay? And that is just what you would expect to come from somebody who has that kind of strong or strict Christian faith, okay? So I'm sure that Schindler would look upon people who disagree with that and basically say they haven't fully understood the implications of belief in God. And this poses a real challenge to the rest of us as to exactly what is required of us as people who believe, okay? It's not super easy to solve. It's easy to solve if all you want is peace. And you're kind of willing to deal with that. But you know, he is posing a legitimate question here, and he's attempting to answer it consistently. So, you know, this positive idea of freedom then defines the good life for us, right? The good life is defined as opposed to us defining it for ourselves and changing over the course of time, however we want. And it wants to aim human institutions towards that higher goal. So both church and the institutions of state, it wants to kind of move in the direction of that goal, influence it. We'll talk more about its relationship with the state in a moment. Freedom, then, is living in a truly human way, which in Catholic Christianity, for Schindler, would be in full relationship with God and community, i.e., the body of Christ, the church. Okay. So at this point, we can see again why he names his book The Politics of the Real. This is not the God or religion of pure potential for people to fill in the blank or to think that some point down the road in the future, there might be this full flourishing if I can only convince the majority of people on any given election year. But rather, it is the God of the actual or real once one embraces the reality of their faith. Okay, in this way of thinking, once they embrace the reality of their faith, then they've grasped the real, and then everything ought to be ordered towards it. So that provides a defined order. It's out of the individual's hand at that point, right? And there's a lot less individualism in this way or this approach. Okay. He says on page 81, in fact, properly understood, it is the end of man. Freedom is ultimately what we are set free for, right? When he says it is the end of man, he means this community in the body of Christ. It is the telos, the ultimate, achievement, the place where we're supposed to end up. We are set free for that. That's so very different from the concept of freedom that even most religious people in the United States have, that I would say, like it or not, eventually agree with it or not, it's extremely challenging and therefore good for people, to think this through. This book that very much helps. If the church is the extension of the body of Christ into the world, he argues, then the act of faith is essentially social or indeed communal and not merely an individual choice. It is the objective common good. So at this point, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm sitting here thinking, so what does that even feel like? Because I've lived my entire life within this political economy, right? In which individual choice is the only thing that really exists in our minds. I don't think we have a lot of choices in reality, but certainly in the mental space, this is how we're trained. And it's ingrained in me. And so I'm thinking, how can a social or community, how can a social group or a community perform an act of faith unless all the individuals first do that and decide to do it together? Well, it would require a pre-existing social, cultural, spiritual milieu, which doesn't exist at the moment. So we haven't answered yet, how this could possibly, let's say, come into being. We haven't even gotten into necessarily whether it ever existed before either. Although I think Schindler would definitely Schindler argues that it did, at least to a certain extent, and that was shattered by liberalism. But he doesn't want to go back. We've already established that. So, how would we get this in a world that has become very, very disintegrated, fragmented? So he turns to this idea of the order of goods, okay, that he's begun to discuss already, with this idea that, the full flourishing of human beings is in the body of Christ, the church. Okay. And he says, for instance, on page 84, Christ is not in the first place an extrinsic object of our individual choice and belief, but the prior reality that enables our choice and belief. The reality of Christ, and therefore the reality of the church, precedes and so makes possible both freedom and faith. So I think he's asserting a reality there that you might say maybe he's arguing that we've forgotten this reality, that this is a pre-existing reality that is still there, that we have forgotten or we're avoiding or ignoring, but that somehow it can reassert itself, much like, natural law itself. Whether we agree with it or not, it asserts itself because it expresses something real and operable in the world. Okay, so this may be what he's saying here, but I think the quote kind of gets a little bit closer to the idea of precedence, right? It precedes, it is the background. And somehow through liberalism, he argues we've lost track of this. He says on the next page, the individuals can have a real potential for community only if the good that brings them together precedes them in reality as already given. Without the priority of an actual common good, the best one can have is a set of individuals bound together through interlocking particular goods. And I guess if he had to critique communitarianism, it would be on this basis, right? That the communitarian says, let us reestablish the common good by having a dialogue about what that common good is and reach agreement, and then nudge people who don't agree into agreement. And once we get pretty close to full agreement, then we can have more community, okay? No, that's still like a liberal individual process. It's a political process. He's talking about something bigger and something that I am thinking that he is insisting still there, and that somehow our attention needs to be redirected towards it. He begins to talk about subsidiarity. And he says that even subsidiarity, which is this Catholic Christian concept of, things should be done by the lowest proper level possible. We don't need to have the totally top-down church or top-down state that, various arms or elements of society should be responsible for what they can do well, without having to be governed from above, okay? Now, in the liberal system, he says the state is above the church, which is seen even ideally in terms of liberal subsidiarity, as the concept of subsidiarity as it fits within the liberal framework. The church becomes one branch which does its little thing, which is, giving communion and being a place for people to worship God. And it stays out of other things. And it certainly stays out of governance, organizing people generally. And so it's kind of on a level with business and service clubs and families and so on and so forth as subsidiaries to to this larger entity, the state. But he says the proper sense of subsidiarity would see the state as an intermediate community and the church as transcending the state in importance, right? He's already made clear he's not going to be arguing for integralism or theocracy, okay? But nevertheless, in importance, the church transcends the state because, in his view, it is capable in a way the state is not, of not only formulating the common good and representing it, but also embodying it, being the place that people look to for the authority and influence necessary to achieve more unity in values and purpose. So in his view, this at least ideal situation would foster real community, not the sort of liberal communitarian community, which is still based on individuals consenting with the implicit right to withdraw at any point. And with the church and state, he says, operating in tandem, or as he puts it, analogically, in different spheres, but without one dictating to the other. The church with higher authority because it deals with the fundamentals of, why we are here, what we are for, how we can live our lives so that we achieve flourishing, especially with the highest good, the relationship with God. So the church has that level of authority. And of course, that's going to mean that some of that authority also colors what the state does. And the church's priorities then, through the influence on society, would of course influence the state without dictating to the state or having a strict hierarchy of power, right? And when he says the state has the power, that is, the state is still the executive, right? And not getting into whether any sort of like democracy could exist in this system. I think it probably could. But I don't know if it would need to. There could probably be a lot of different types of governments that could adopt this type of thing, at least ideally, right? But democracy could exist and perhaps even do much better in this type of system because there would be more agreement. But still, the question, of course, is even if all this sounds good to you, and I'm sure for some of you it remains kind of scary, but even if this all sounded good to you, there's still the very big question of how do you get there? Well, unlike a lot of authors who just avoid those kinds of questions like the plague, because they're so big and they're so hard to answer, it's so much easier just to kind of get you all the way there and then leave you hanging. Schindler actually gives some promise that he might really take a good stab at trying to do this. And he does just a little bit in this chapter. He talks about, one way, although it's not the best way, could be the confessional state, which is a state that sort of sponsors a religion. Like in the case of England, it's the official Church of England. King Charles now is the head of the official Church of England, right? Of course, I think Schindler would prefer the Catholic Church be involved, but that's a confessional state. And it's not perfect because it's still, it has its own dangers, when the state more or less supports the church, or when the state says, we're going to financially support and give our authority to this church. It still puts the church independence of the state, and the state is more important. And maybe especially because King Charles is the head of the church. So it's not the best. And then he talks about what I would call full Catholicity. Okay. And so he gives you a glimpse here. I'm just going to read this. Is on page 102. He says, at the same time, however, the principle opens up other possibilities. Perhaps, as we suggested above, even something entirely new with respect to history. Well, and wouldn't it have to be new? You know, I mean, I think we've established that we can't just go backwards, right? So it would have to be something new and different from even this confessional state idea. So he continues, for example, it would be conceivable, given the principle of analogy, to have a state that recognizes the authority of the church, and then precisely by virtue of this dependence on the church, is able to avail itself of all the church's internal resources, her theology of religious pluralism, her theology of grace as liberating nature's integrity, her natural theology regarding the intellect's innate capacity to understand God as origin and end, her natural law tradition, her constant insistence on the integrity and capacity of reason, her defense of philosophy and its abiding distinction from theology, her recognition of freedom as integral to the meaning of truth, and so forth. And then a little bit further down, he says, the question one would have to put to those concerned that we respect the cultural diversity of the contemporary West is whether liberalism has greater theological resources for religious pluralism than Catholicism does. The answer proposed in this chapter is that liberalism has no resources for any divergence from a notion of religion as a private good achieved through individual choice. Liberalism is absolutist and totalitarian. There's the answer to the title, recognizing no religion other than its own. That is the religion of sort of pure potentiality, right? The religion of individual choice or the emptiness of the state, the negative freedom of the state. So, I mean, that's some real food for thought, right? There's an assertion here that if the church was in its proper role, and I guess we'd have to say properly understood itself, that it would be more generous than the state, the liberal state has been towards different faiths and diversities. That type of tolerance is different from liberal tolerance. So it's just an interesting, I don't know if that's true or not, you know, I don't know how we would know. Obviously the past hasn't always proven, you know, that the church or any other entity has like consistently practiced this broadness and toleration. One could argue that the church has itself grown and is perhaps more capable now than ever before of having that kind of position of generosity. Anyway, so you get a little picture into what it would look like. Still not an answer as to how in the world we would get there. The first option, the confessional state, actually sounds way more possible than the latter, right? This sounds way harder to possibly achieve in the current context. So we'll see, you know, if he eventually gives us an idea of where to start. Some of the pictures in this presentation have suggested, you know, the Catholic Church, one of the things that it has that other churches don't have, other Christian churches, is this this international stand, you know, in other words, the presence of the church is truly international. And yes, other churches have international components, but nothing like the Catholic Church at the level of its organization and importance, recognized by other people, other peoples, other entities in a way that is unique. And so I think there's something to this in the sense that if one were to look for a Christian faith-based alternative to the current system, it would almost have to, if it didn't come from below, from sort of Christian communalism that protests against empire by starting its own community and kind of doing its own thing to the extent it can, such as maybe a Hauerwas would recommend, then what else but the Catholic Church would you turn to for this kind of thing? All right, so probably enough for one day. I will continue and move forward into at least chapter 4 next time.